So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, we actually wrap up this story with its conclusion. And so what I want to do is actually backtrack for a second with the return of Galactus. And the reason why is because in the last video, I actually got carried away. Admittedly, I was so just taken away by the events that were unfolding that I didn't quite include some of the information that needed to be discussed. And what I mean here is that if you guys recall, we had talked about how Johnny Storm had been killed facing off against the horde of Annihilus in the negative zone. And again, the reason why this was done is because Jonathan Hickman was basically building up to this idea of Earth being this giant battleground, that the forces of Annihilus wanted to invade the Earth, that the Kree Armada wanted to invade the Earth to destroy the Inhumans, that these forces of the old Atlanteans wanted to take back the surface world, that the people within the Forever City who had their evolution sped up by the Ascension engine wanted to take back the surface. And so it was basically everybody descending onto the surface of the Earth or coming to Earth in some form or fashion. Well, with Johnny Storm, what we learn here is that while he did die per se during the forces of Annihilus, he was actually resurrected using the worms of Annihilus. And the worms of Annihilus are basically one aspect of the forces of the negative zone that have the ability to basically heal the body of mortal people and bring them back to life. Now, this really, I guess, requires us, or Hickman requires us, to just kind of suspend disbelief here, to basically say that yes, Johnny Storm was dead, his soul never left his body, it was just kind of hanging there and he kept coming back. But the goal of Annihilus in bringing Johnny Storm back to life was to effectively torture him. And he did this in a couple ways. The first way was to show Johnny Storm pictures of the Earth, his intention to invade it, to destroy all life on the planet. But the other half was to acquire the access codes to access the gate that would let him invade the universe, invade Earth. But Johnny Storm wouldn't give him this information, and so the result was that Annihilus kept killing and resurrecting Johnny Storm. Now, while Johnny Storm was being killed and resurrected, once the time came when Annihilus was approached by the alternate version of Reed Richards from a different universe who offered Annihilus the way to access Earth, if Annihilus was willing to help him in turn, then there was no need for Johnny Storm. And so Johnny was basically put in a prison. And so because of this, Johnny began talking to other prisoners around there, and it began taking some coaxing. It took a little bit of work on his behalf, but the idea here is that in the eyes of Johnny Storm, because he's fought against Annihilus so often, because he's met Annihilus on a multitude of occasions, being that the villain Annihilus first appeared as one of the earliest enemies of the Fantastic Four, that Johnny knows how to defeat him. And the way to defeat Annihilus is to capture his cosmic control rod. Now, for those of you guys who have seen my video on Franklin Richards Explained, we had talked about the cosmic control rod, and that this is actually the source of Franklin's powers. Franklin is a mutant per se, but Marvel never really gives us an actual explanation. They never really square this circle in terms of Franklin's mutant powers and the fact that he can warp reality. But the fact remains that because of his abilities, because of what he's capable of, this is all a byproduct of the fact that when he was being born, because of the fact that Susan Storm's life was being threatened, because it was possible that she would die in the birthing process because of the complications that Franklin was presenting, that Reed Richards and Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm traveled to the negative zone. They met Annihilus for the first time. They captured his cosmic control rod, which allows Annihilus to harness cosmic energies, and then brought that back to Earth and used that in order for Susan Storm to give birth to Franklin. And so Franklin and the cosmic control rod are really part and parcel to one another. But the fact remains that Annihilus is able to control the forces of the Annihilation Wave using the cosmic control rod. And so for those of you guys who are always curious as to how it is that Annihilus maintains complete control over these virtually endless, amounts of forces and so on, he does it by virtue of the cosmic control rod, because it basically allows him to control the negative zone's equivalent of the power cosmic. And so what happens is that once Johnny and these various, prisoners begin to band together, when the event is taking place whereby the portal is supposed to be open and Annihilus is supposed to send his forces in, Johnny Storm and his group make their presence known, and they basically initiate their attack. And what they do is they start assaulting as many forces as they can, but the goal is to both distract Annihilus as well as take his cosmic control rod from him. But the problem is that because Annihilus is relatively intelligent in terms of battle tactics, in terms of warfare, he immediately knows what it is that they're trying to do. And so as they descend on Annihilus, he basically starts killing off every single one of them, and it ultimately boils down to Annihilus and Johnny Storm fighting one another. And so initially, Hickman doesn't tell us exactly how things turn out. All we know is that the cosmic control rod went flying out of the hand of Annihilus, and both he and Johnny Storm were reaching for it. But what happens is that things begin to pan out, that we begin to get a bigger picture of what's going on, and we see that Johnny Storm harnessed the cosmic control rod. And this is really interesting because for those of you guys who are familiar with Jonathan Hickman's run on Avengers and New Avengers during Time Runs Out that led up to Secret Wars, and even during Secret Wars itself, a constant theme was everything dies. And this again is basically Hickman harkening back to his own story, to the Fantastic Four. There's a lot of crossover between the stories that Hickman writes during his time in Marvel Comics. That's why I say you can basically read Hickman's Fantastic Four, you can read his Secret Warriors, you can read his short-term run on S.H.I.E.L.D., and you can read Time Runs Out and Secret Wars all in chronological order, and it tells a self-contained story outside of the rest of Marvel's cosmology. But the fact remains here that with Johnny Storm having the power of the cosmic control rod, he's almost on the same level as God. Now, one of the big things to differentiate here is that the cosmic control rod is used in relation to the person who's wielding it. And so while it does have incredible power, it doesn't mean you'll have the power of God. It simply just means that you're going to be able to use it for whatever purpose you best know how. In the case of Johnny Storm, he's basically able to amplify his own powers to manipulate plasma and fire-based energies. Now from here, we actually jump, and again, this is all before the arrival of Galactus on Earth at the end of our last video, we jump to the Fantastic Four meeting Galactus on the moon. And the reason why this matters is because for those of you guys who were curious at the end of our last video how it was that Reed had summoned Galactus, this is how. What happens is Reed is provided with an artifact called the Ark. And what Galactus says is that on Earth, there's what's called a Galactus seed. Now, some of you guys may have heard of this. Some of you guys during your travels across the Marvel Wikipedia or something like that, or on Reddit or in your forums or something along those lines, may have heard of a phrase called the Galactic seed, or the Galactus seed. And what this is when Galactus was originally birthed, so to speak, into the universe, when he came into existence, the cosmic entity Eternity, which represents the entire, encompasses the entirety of the universe, had basically created a means for the universe to be reborn once it's destroyed. And this is what the Galactus seed is. The Galactus seed is basically this reality's version of Galactus who will be born anew in the new universe. The problem with this is that there are individuals who seek to harness that Galactus seed, and we'll find out who those people are. But with the Galactus seed here on Earth, the issue is that if somebody were to get a hold of it, and if somebody were to use it, it's an immature Galactus. It's not a fully fleshed out Galactus. And the result is that it would replace Galactus himself and bring something much, much worse. Now, Hickman doesn't exactly tell us what that is, and we don't really need to know per se because we never really find out. But what happened was after Eternity had created the Galactus seed and put it on Earth, it was eventually discovered by the Asgardians. And the Asgardians had taken the Galactus seed and put it in Asgard, which is where the world tree comes from. And so that's why if you guys hear people say things like Galactus is searching for the Galactus seed and it's on Asgard, this is what they're talking about. This is what they're referring to. Now, Hickman does a little bit of retconning here. What he says is that because the Galactus seed was discovered by Bor, who was the man who originally created Asgard, that Bor had used the Galactus seed to create the universe. But again, we're not really going with that. We're kind of relying on my interpretation with regards to a history of the Marvel Universe. And so this is just a bit of information. If you choose to pursue it, you're more than welcome to, but I wouldn't really take it as gospel truth just because of the fact that Jonathan Hickman doesn't really provide a full-scale explanation on this. But what happens here is Galactus says that a time is coming, an event is going to be taking place relatively soon, whereby his presence will be needed. He will have to be summoned by Reed Richards. And when that time comes, Reed will know when that moment arrives. He'll know what time, or I guess when to summon Galactus, at which point he will do that. And so what happens here is we basically, we transition a bit, and we actually pick up with this really interesting childlike story of Franklin Richards. Now, this is very, very, very important. This is wildly important. And the reason why is because this is going to help connect the dots. This is going to go from point A to point B, especially when we get to the adult version of Franklin Richards. What happened here is it actually jumps back to the point at which the adult Franklin Richards had woken up the power of his younger self. And initially Franklin had experimented, of course he had created a pocket universe, and then it just kind of gives us a run over of the things that we've seen so far, that Franklin made this pocket universe but didn't know what to do with it, so he put it in a closet, and then Johnny Storm died and everybody everybody mourned for Johnny Storm and that kind of thing. But then what happens is Franklin and Leech actually go into the closet to see what happened to that universe that Franklin had made. And what happens is once they tumble in, they end up on a fully formed Earth. This Earth has inhabitants, it has people, it has cars, it has all kinds of stuff. And what we actually learn is there's villains, there's good guys, there's bad guys. It really is just a completely formed reality in and of itself. And so what happens is Franklin and Leech, of course, go on their own little escapades and they fight their own adventures. And what we would expect for kids to do, of course, they make their little jokes and things like that. But what ends up happening is a man that we can't see, visits the two of them. And he says, you guys can do a whole lot better than this. You know, Franklin, you can do much, much better than what you've done here. And so he basically takes them on a tour of this universe. And what we learn is that, of course, in addition to this Earth being fully formed, that Franklin has basically created everything. He's created a whole functioning, fully working universe in and of itself. He's created life, he's created gods, he's done all that kind of stuff. And so what this unknown man does is he asks Leech, he says, if you can create everything, if Franklin made everything in this universe, then what does that make Franklin? And Leech says, it makes him God. And so this is a very important thing to remember, because what we'll find out is that in a lot of ways, Franklin is a god. It's crazy the kind of things that he can do, again, especially when we get to his older self. And so what we do here is we pick back up again with the Kree Armada, which is invading the planet Earth. Again, this is prior to the arrival of Galactus, as he was summoned by Reed at the end of our last video. But we pick up with the Kree Armada who are attacking the planet Earth. And of course, we have the Avengers, and we have, you know, what's remained, or I guess what remains of the Fantastic Four. We have a multitude of forces who are all doing their best. But because of the fact that Annihilus's forces had already begun the process of opening the portal prior to his defeat by Johnny Storm, once the portal's open, Johnny emerges with Annihilus as his prisoner and meets Peter Parker. And this is a big deal because they all thought Johnny Storm was dead. Everyone believed that he had long since been gone. And so what happens is Peter tells Johnny, he says, hey, look, man, yes, it's cool that you took out Annihilus's forces, but we have a lot of other stuff going on too. Earth is effectively being invaded by everybody. And so what happens is that as they're fighting their way through, as they're attempting to battle, I guess the Avengers and the Fantastic Four are attempting to battle these various Kree forces, Johnny Storm makes his signature 4 in the sky. And this is basically him telling everybody that he's back. And this is a really cool moment. This is a really great aspect of Hickman's run, because he could have just appeared to Susan Storm and Reed Richards and Ben Grimm and could have said, hey guys, I'm back. But for him to basically create his little insignia, the Fantastic Four insignia in the sky, this is a hallmark of Johnny Storm's character. And so what better way to bring him back to the land of the living than to have him do the one thing that he's best known for, which is to create his signature. And so of course it takes Ben Grimm and it takes Reed Richards and Susan Storm by surprise, but it also empowers them because they're like, Johnny Storm's back, we can do anything now. And the reason why this is important is because after the death of Johnny Storm, none of them felt whole. They felt like a portion of them was gone, like it was missing. But now that they know Johnny Storm is back, the Fantastic Four is complete again. They all have that part of themselves that was missing. And it reflects itself in the fact that Ben Grimm musters from near sheer defeat and rallies himself along with all the other Avengers and the other, I guess the remainder of the Fantastic Four, and continue their attack against the Kree Armada. And so once Johnny Storm is officially welcomed back, of course, again, the Avengers and all these various forces begin to rally themselves. And at the same time, the Kree Armada continues its onslaught of attacks against everybody. And so what we do here is we basically pick up with the end of the last video and the return of Galactus as he was summoned by Reed Richards. Now again, what's funny here is that when Galactus arrives, he says, why am I here? Why have you summoned me to this place? And Reed says, well, you told us when we knew it was time, and it's time. Like, it's time that you are here because we assume this is what you meant. And Galactus says, no, this is not why you were supposed to call me. You were supposed to call me because there's something much worse coming than this. And again, Hickman doesn't really tell us what it is that Galactus is referring to, but Galactus says, of course, he'll take care of the Kree Armada, and he immediately just wipes out virtually everybody. And so, of course, you have again the leader of the Kree, the Supreme Intelligence. He's on his head ship, and his forces are asking him, what do we do? How are we supposed to deal with this? And once Galactus obliterates these forces, the Supreme Intelligence says, let's just go. In addition addition to this, Galactus says, after destroying these forces, that the reason why he was supposed to be here has finally made itself present in the fact that the Mad Celestials have now appeared at the planet Earth. Now again, for those of you guys who have not seen my series so far, the Mad Celestials were Celestials from an alternate reality whereby they had gone insane and they had forced the denizens of that reality to worship them. But when Reed Richards went in to visit the Council of Reeds, the Mad Celestials were awakened. They were made aware of the Council by the actions of another version of Reed Richards. And so the Mad Celestials had found their way into the Council. They had begun killing off all the Reeds. And the last we knew was that they had basically taken over the Council chamber itself, but we didn't know where it was that they were going to. We didn't know what direction they were heading in. And really, Hickman had never really given us anything with regards to these individuals up until this point. And so what happens is initially everybody is just kind of flabbergasted. They're totally stunned here. And Galactus says, you guys need to leave. You guys do not need to be here. And so when they initially say, no, Galactus, you need to go away. We're going to consume this planet. We're going to destroy this world. We're going to take this universe as our own. Galactus tells them to read his mind so that they can understand where it is that he's coming from. And when this happens, the Mad Celestials realize that Galactus knows where they come from. He knows what their will is. And so the Mad Celestials then turn and begin fighting Galactus. And so it's effectively Galactus against 4 Celestials. Now, with Reed Richards, he's watching these events unfold, and he initially doesn't want to leave. And admittedly, I probably wouldn't want to either. I'd want to see how this event unfolds. Fortunately, we are the reader, which means we get to see what happens. And so as Galactus is facing off against these Celestials, of course, again, the Kree Armada bails out. They all take off. The Inhumans go back to the planet Earth. Everybody's just kind of like, this is way too big for us. We got no dog in this fight, and they all start bailing out. And so all that's really left here are the Fantastic Four, and of course, Galactus fighting off these Celestials. And so while he is able to kill one of them, the fact remains that the Celestials are still wildly powerful in and of themselves. And what they do is they merge and they combine into one Mega Celestial. And this Mega Celestial dwarfs Galactus in size, as well as overpowers Galactus with the greatest of ease. Now, when Galactus is overpowered and he is effectively killed and sent back to the planet Earth, what this does is this ties into the Old Man Logan story that we had talked about, where in that future reality of Old Man Logan, those individuals had found the body of Galactus or had used the body of Galactus and brought him back. And so this is again another example of how all of Hickman's stuff ties in, about how all of Hickman's stuff comes together, and it basically wraps up all these different plot holes and things like that. And so what we do is we follow the Fantastic Four as they head back to Saul's Anvil. Now again, Saul's Anvil was created by the alternate reality versions of Reed for the purpose of basically destroying any sort of being that could arrive on Earth and try to usurp their will. But we actually also learned that it was designed for the purpose of destroying these Mad Celestials. And so what happens is that while Galactus is presumably dead and these Mad Celestials are making their way towards Earth or descending into Earth, that Reed begins to power up Saul's Anvil. And what he does is he shoots it at this Mega Celestial, and it completely disperses the Celestial's armor. Now, Reed's initial response here is to say that the engine is charging back up again and they'll be ready for another shot, but his father says, no, it doesn't matter. You never get any more than one shot. And that's exactly what happens. As soon as that shot goes off and the Celestials' physical bodies are forced to break apart back into their 3 normal forms, they basically attack the entire facility and they destroy Saul's Anvil. And so with Johnny Storm empowered by the Cosmic Control Rod, he uses his newfound powers to damage one of the Celestials. But again, that's all he does. All he does is damage them. And so they immediately turn on Johnny Storm and they take him out. Now, they don't kill him. They simply just incapacitate him. And so Susan Storm uses her powers to create force fields to basically block off Reed Richards and Spider-Man, Valeria Richards, Franklin, and herself to keep them safe from the powers of the Celestials. And this is actually really interesting here because what Hickman is telling us is that the force fields that Susan Storm can make are able to withstand the power of a Celestial. And this is pretty big. This is pretty significant. There are very, very, very few people, in fact, you can really count them on one hand, that can create force fields that can withstand cosmic level beings. And so this is Hickman basically telling us, Susan Storm, yes, she's the one that kind of keeps the family in check, but she's not somebody to walk over. She's not someone to snuff your nose at. She's pretty damn powerful in the kind of things that she can do. And so again, while she does her best to try to hold everybody off, in the end, the shield just doesn't quite hold. And so Reed Richards and Franklin Richards, Spider-Man, Nathaniel, they all seem to be completely taken out. And what happens here is Hickman harkens back to Valeria's conversation with her mother when she had traveled into the past, and she had said that things are going to get very bad. Things are going to get very, very dark. They're going to be dark and they're going to be full of loss. And as is going to feel like everything is going to shatter, that the world is going to break apart, that nothing's going to be able to hold. And when that time comes, that Susan needs to keep everything together. She needs to keep herself together as best she can and keep on fighting no matter what happens. And so again, in this last little bit of recollection, Valeria had told Susan, when the time comes, when you feel like you can't fight anymore and you want to give up, look into the sky and remember the price that was paid. And so what happens, I love this part of the story so much. And so what happens is a light opens up above Susan's storm. And when she looks up, it's the adult Franklin Richards and Valeria. Now, this is some shit, because this is when things get awesome. This is when things get so good. They get so amazing. So, of course, Susan's reaction to the future version of her son Franklin and Valeria is, oh my God, this is so awesome. This is so cool. But Nathaniel says it worked. And this is when Hickman starts wrapping things up. This is when he basically begins to ramp up and answer all these questions that we had about the story up to this point. So for those of you guys who may have found yourselves a little lost, a little confused, trying to understand what direction this was all going in, this is going to take care of that, because this is Hickman writing. Hickman starts from the end and works his way to the beginning whenever he writes stories. He actually said that in an interview. It's really cool here. But what happens is Franklin appears before one of the Celestials, and when they analyze him, they immediately say that he's beyond Omega classification, that he's a galactic danger, he's a galactic constant, he's a universal shaper. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what this means, it means Franklin Richards controls the Marvel Universe, that he controls everything, that he can make the universe what he wants it to be, and he is easily equivalent to the Celestials in power. But the idea here is that he's actually not. And this is what's interesting. Hickman kind of blurs the line between the adult Franklin Richards and what it is that he's capable of. And the reason why I say that is because we don't know how powerful these Celestials are in comparison to a normal being. For example, Galactus was able to destroy one of them, but the three of them were able to form themselves into a singular entity and take out Galactus. And so the question is, if they did that again, would they destroy Franklin Richards? But before they were able to do that, Franklin Richards effectively whisks them away. He simply sends them to another part of the universe. Now, this keeps them sort of confused and it keeps them at bay. And this is actually what Franklin says. He basically says it'll confuse them for a little bit. But we also learn here that this was all part of the bigger plan. This was part of a plan that was orchestrated by Nathaniel, Valeria, and Franklin himself. Now, this plan will be explained here in a couple minutes, but something I want you to take note of is that Franklin actually asked for the powers of his younger self. And this is why this matters, is because referencing our discussion on the man that visited Franklin while he and Leech were exploring the universe, this was his older self. The older adult Franklin Richards was basically training his younger self in how to use his powers. And so that when the time came, Franklin would be able to store those energies inside of himself and give them to his older self. And so basically, future Franklin Richards has twice as much power as he normally would, which is insane. And so once the Mad Celestials make their return, Franklin Richards descends and begins to engage them in battle. And this is where Hickman begins to answer our questions. Reed's question is, can Franklin win on his own? And Nathaniel says, no, he cannot. He cannot win this battle by himself. It's just not possible. Now, again, this is where I say that Hickman sort of blurs the line here, because we've read stories where Franklin has fought multiversal entities and won. But in this particular situation, he's not able to face these Celestials on his own and succeed. But what Nathaniel says is that Franklin will find a way, that he always has to find a way. And again, Nathaniel begins to give us some answers here. What Nathaniel tells us is that this was the day, this moment right now, this was the day that all of Reed's actions had caught up to him. But Franklin Richards was the one that figured it out. Franklin Richards was the one that realized that if his father could be saved, that the future, the universe, could be spared. And so when Reed asks how it is that it got to this point, what it is that resulted in this situation, what Nathaniel tells us is that there are universal constants. There are things that will always happen and just cannot be changed. And one of the things was that Reed always created the portal. In every reality, he always created the portal. In every reality, he always walked into the portal and met those versions of himself. In every instance where Nathaniel has traveled back into the past and tried to change things, they've always happened the exact same way. That Reed Richards has been part of the council, that he built, I guess he fixed suns, that he built universes, that the Mad Celestials were always woken up, and that Reed always escaped, but the Mad Celestials always came back and they always killed Reed. every single time they always killed Reed Richards. But what Nathaniel says is that there comes a time as a parent where you just kind of have to step back. You have to realize that you've done everything you can as a parent, that you've taught your children everything you can, and that who they are is who they're going to be for the rest of their lives. But Franklin was not happy about that. Franklin was not willing to accept that. Franklin wanted his father to live, and that is the basis of this story. The entire run of Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four is Franklin Richards trying to save his dad's life. And so what happens here is Franklin basically uses the power of his younger self and brings Galactus back to life. Not only that, he does it in the most awesome way possible. He throws the energy into Galactus and summons Galactus as his Herald. Now, how awesome is that? It's one of the coolest things in the entire run of Marvel Comics. And Hickman gives us this amazing, discussion here. He gives us this amazing monologue while everyone is watching on. While the Fantastic Four are watching these events unfold, they're literally looking at Franklin as an adult who possesses powers of a god. He possesses powers hitherto unrivaled by anybody in the Marvel Universe, save maybe Matthew Malloy, and even then, that's a stretch. And so while Galactus and Franklin are able to successfully take on all these things, what happens is that Nathaniel basically says the reason why Franklin went back in the first place, the reason why Franklin chose to save his father's life in the first place is because Reed abandoned the council, and that is his one act. That's the one saving grace. And all the other members of the council, they had all left their families. They had all abandoned their children. They had abandoned Susan. They had abandoned Ben Grimm. They had abandoned all their own realities versions of their family and friends. But our Earth 616 version of Reed did not do that. And the result was that he had a son that wanted to see him live. Franklin wanted him to come back to life. And so what happens is that as this battle is beginning to come to a close, as it's beginning to wrap up, that the explosion, the death of these Celestials creates a light in the sky that rivals that of the sun. And everyone sees it. Every single person sees it. Captain America and the Avengers, the White Manes who were fighting alongside Reed Richards, the Future Foundation. But at the same time, it also harkens to the fact that this light, this sort of explodes into the sky, is representative of the fact that everything's changing now, that everything's moving in a totally different direction, that Marvel now has a player on the chessboard who could effectively dominate everybody else. But more so than that it harkens to the idea of all these heroes on Earth, the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, whatever members from the X-Men chose to fight, that they all single-handedly saved the universe or saved their world in what was probably one of the most extreme battles in the universe. And it all just sort of harkens back to this idea that Franklin Richards seems to have perished in the conflict, but in fact that he didn't. That basically it gave the chance for humanity to effectively start over again, to sort of rectify its ways in light of the fact that a single man saved them from complete and total annihilation. And so as this begins to wrap up, as this story begins to come to a close, we transition to the epilogue. And what we do is we actually pick back up as kind of a throwback to the beginning of the story, when Reed Richards' father, Nathaniel, was telling him to jump off a jungle gym and Nathaniel would catch him. And it was designed to teach bravery. It was designed to teach Reed that it's okay to fail, that it's okay to make mistakes, but it's not okay to quit before you even start. And so Franklin, as a child, is terrified of this situation. And so while his, of course, adult self is watching on alongside Susan and Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm and Spider-Man and so on, Reed tells his son the exact same thing. He tells him it's okay to fail. It's okay to make mistakes, but to not even try is completely unacceptable. And so Reed tells Franklin, do his best, do the best that he absolutely can. And so Franklin, for the first time in the history of his life as a young child, begins to let his powers flourish in a way that simply hasn't been seen before, by simply jumping into the sky and flying. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. There is some more stuff that happens after this, but if you want to know what it is, you got to buy the story and read it. But I really hope you guys enjoyed this, because Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four is probably one of the best things that you're ever going to read in Marvel Comics. It is incredible. But I hope you guys really enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you drop a like, throw some comments down, let me know what you guys think. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.